You know those photos that hide mysterious and disturbing things? Get to know the story behind them, choose the scariest one, and leave it in the comments. Before we start, subscribe to the channel that will keep you up at night. Ebenezer McBurney Byers, known as EBEN Byers, was born in April 1880. He attended Yale University and was a member of Pittsburgh's high society. He focused his time on one of his passions, golf, and eventually became a world-class golfer, even winning the U.S. Amateur Tournament in 1906. However, his success was short-lived, as he was defeated in the same tournament in 1916, thus ending his golf career. EBEN Byers interrupted his sports career and became president of his father's steel company, which was incredibly successful. Overnight, he became a multimillionaire, immediately investing in luxury properties all over the country. He acquired stables for horse racing in the UK and the US. In addition to all these incredible possessions, Byers, through his role as company president, began to connect with very powerful and influential people, such as the founders and executives of Coca-Cola. In other words, he lacked absolutely nothing, and his life was going very well. However, in 1927, at the age of 47, Byers began to feel exhausted and saturated from work. He decided to take some time off and went to watch a football game. His idea was to take a train from Pittsburgh to New Haven in Connecticut. After the game ended, Byers took the train back to Pittsburgh and decided to rest. He climbed to the upper bunk and, within a few minutes, fell asleep. But the train stopped abruptly. He fell to the floor, hitting the left side of his body hard. Feeling a lot of pain, he got up believing he was okay, but within a few seconds, a sharp pain hit his left arm. Not knowing exactly what was happening, he tried to move his arm, stretch it, and massage it, hoping that the pain would go away. When it finally eased a bit, he returned to the bunk and fell asleep. Hours later, upon arriving at the station in Pittsburgh, upon waking up, the sharp pain immediately returned. Byers got off the train and went straight home to drop off his luggage. Worried about the unbearable pain, he went to his physiotherapist's office. He quickly examined Byers' shoulder, determining that there was no structural damage. Even so, Byers continued to complain of pain, so his doctor C.C. Moyer suggested a new product on the market called Radithor, known to relieve pain and provide an energy boost. Byers went to the pharmacy to buy a 15-milliliter bottle of this liquid. Upon arriving home, the first thing Byers did was go to the kitchen, grab a spoon, and drink a bit of this tonic, as the recipe indicated. Shortly after doing this, he began to feel a great energy, and within a few minutes, he noticed the twinges in his left arm decreasing. All the claims about what this tonic could do were coming true. Over the next few days, Byers continued taking the same prescribed amount, and each passing day, he felt better. Not just because the pain in his arm was disappearing, but overall, he felt happier and full of energy. Ben was satisfied with Radithor. He thought it was like a miracle cure. To continue feeling good, he started to take more and more, and he reached a point where he was consuming doses far beyond what had been prescribed to him. This is where the story changes. 2 years after this period, Byers' obsession had escalated. He was no longer taking just a few milliliters a day. Now, he was drinking almost 3 bottles of Radithor daily. It was at this point that something happened, and Byers began to lose strength and rapidly lose weight, suffering unbearable headaches and complaining of intense pain in his lower jaw. Doctors diagnosed sinusitis, but shortly after, his teeth began to fall out, and lesions appeared on his face. The doctors could only advise to stop the Radithor, but they could do nothing more. In 1931, the lower part of his jaw began to loosen, reaching the point of completely separating from the skull. The doctors had no other option but to surgically remove it, but days later, Byers began to feel the same in the upper part. The doctors had to completely remove the jaw, leaving him with a huge hole in his face. We can imagine that Byers felt scared and desperate. He didn't know what to do or how to fix his face. In this desperation, the only idea he had was to go back to using Radithor, without the doctor's knowledge, thinking that it would help him recover his jaw. And here is where the situation worsens. After consuming about 1,400 bottles of Radithor over 3 years, Byers' body began to disintegrate. His bones and tissues of the mouth began to fall apart from the inside out. His figure became monstrous. What happened in reality is that this product, known as Radithor, which Byers consumed in very high doses, was composed of small amounts of radium, an extremely radioactive element. In simpler terms, Byers was suffering from radioactive poisoning. His story quickly became very popular, making headlines in all the newspapers and news broadcasts in the world. A few days later, Byers could no longer get out of bed. His skull now began to crumble, forming holes all over his skull, to the point where his brain was visible. On March 31, 1932, EBEN Byers passed away. Byers' body had to be placed in a lead coffin specially designed to inhibit the radiation emitted by his remains. 30 years later, in 1965, scientists exhumed his skeleton to check if it still emitted radiation. They determined that the radiation levels were exactly the same as the day he died. Currently, it is known that radium has a half-life of 1,600 years, which means that Byers' body will continue to be radioactive for centuries. Until the 1920s, no one had any idea that radioactive material could cause genetic mutations and cancer at high levels of exposure. Much because of the death of EBEN Byers, the FDA made the sale of medications in the United States better regulated. Here is one of the last photos of Byers, shortly after his jaw had been removed. Undoubtedly, a scary photo. During the celebration of the 50th anniversary of the founding of the USSR, Leonid Brezhnev, then leader of the Soviet Union, decided to organize a spectacular space meeting between two Soviet spacecraft. The plan would be to launch two spacecraft into space to perform a dramatic performance, where an orbital docking would be made that would allow the cosmonauts to move between the two ships. The first capsule to be launched would be Soyuz 1, with a cosmonaut inside. The next day, a second vehicle would take off with two more cosmonauts. The two vehicles would meet, docking with each other. The first would move to another ship, swapping places with a colleague, and would return home in the second ship. Brezhnev made it clear that he wanted this to happen. Vladimir Komarov, born in Moscow in March 1927, was chosen to command Soyuz 1 in 1967, with Yuri Gagarin, his best friend, as his backup cosmonaut. Both knew that the spacecraft was not safe to fly, but everyone in the space program was terrified of Brezhnev's reaction to a possible postponement and/or cancellation of the mission. Komarov told his friends he knew he would probably die. He decided to go ahead with the mission to save Yuri, but before leaving, his final wish was that his funeral would have an open coffin so that the engineers and Soviet leadership could see his remains. This mission was of extreme importance to the Soviet Union from a political point of view. The success of the mission was in Komarov's hands, which put him under enormous pressure. He found himself forced to prepare and practice intensely, along with Yuri. In other words, both were doing their utmost to ensure that the mission did not fail. During this period, Yuri and dozens of engineers carried out a complete inspection of the ship and came across 203 structural problems. The whole team was thinking about how to fix this as quickly as possible, but eventually, they concluded that the mission should be postponed. They asked for the mission to be postponed, but this was ignored. The Soviet Union did not care about risking its astronauts to win the space race against the United States. When Komarov learned that the ship had all these problems and that the government ignored the recommendations, he felt disappointed and frustrated. An agent asked why he did not refuse, but Komarov said it was impossible, because if he did not make this flight, it would be his best friend Yuri who would be put in this trap. Yuri begged Komarov to give up the mission and let him go in his place, but Komarov had already made a decision and was aware of everything that would happen. So, on April 23, 1967, the mission took off and almost immediately, the problems began. To start, the ship did not have enough power and the communication system was failing. The ship began to fail little by little and, later, began to spin without any control. Those who were monitoring the ship from Earth immediately realized that this was a mistake and that the mission should be aborted. So, they ordered the mission to be aborted and the ship to return. Komarov was trying to return to the Earth's atmosphere. The problem was that, due to all these structural failures, it was impossible for him to do so. Komarov tried to return to Earth on 18 different occasions without success. Members of American intelligence recorded the last conversation between Komarov and high-ranking Soviet members. In this last call, Komarov says goodbye. The leader on Earth starts to cry and says he is sorry and that he will be remembered as a hero. He says they brought his wife. Then, Komarov says goodbye to her, asks her to take care of the children, and the call ends. Minutes later, on attempt number 19, Komarov finally managed to align the ship and enter the atmosphere and fire the retro-rockets. Despite his heroic efforts to save the mission, the worst was yet to come. There was another problem. The reserve deceleration parachute ended up detaching from its place. When the reserve parachute came out, it got tangled in the exit track of the main parachute, making it impossible to activate. Some reports of Komarov's last recorded words as he entered the atmosphere were pure insults to the Soviet Union. The audio transcripts of his final moments suggest that he was both distressed and panicked, as it became evident that his return to Earth would be fatal. Komarov was helpless inside the capsule and, in the early hours of April 24, 1967, Soyuz 1 landed near the border between Russia and Kazakhstan. Rescue teams headed to the impact site to rescue Komarov. Many thought that Komarov had lost his life at the moment of impact, but when they saw what was inside the ship, they had a terrible surprise. Inside, they found only some remains of Komarov. In other words, he had been burned alive while falling at high speed. Days later, the funeral was held and, just as Komarov wanted, it was with an open coffin so that the Soviet Union could see what it had cost. This is the photo of Komarov's funeral and what was left of him. So, which photo is scarier? The photo of EBEN BYERS or the photo of Vladimir Komarov? You have 5 seconds to choose. Do you agree with the result? Leave in the comments your chosen photo. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more chills and thrills from Scary Pics.